The rain had begun again, a soft, insistent tapping on the attic window, as if the sky itself were politely asking to be let in. Eleanor Whitmore sat on the narrow bed beneath that window, hands folded over the worn muslin of her skirt, watching droplets race each other down the wavering glass. It was the one window in the house that did not look out onto the street or the neatly kept gardens, the one window no carriage ever passed beneath, no caller ever noticed. From here she saw only the backs of chimneys, a sliver of sky, and if she leaned far enough, the topmost branches of the elm that grew beside the mews. Below, in the bright, polished rooms, her stepmother's guests were arriving. She knew this not by any sound of laughter or the clink of crystal, those sounds were muffled by boards and distance, but by the subtle tremors that ran through the house, the faint shudder as carriage wheels stopped before the front steps, the almost musical clatter of hooves on the cobbles, the distant sweep of the front door opening to admit warm voices and cooler air. Even up here, above the life she was no longer invited to share, Eleanor could feel the evening beginning. She breathed in, slow and steady, willing her chest not to tighten. "It is only a supper," she whispered into the dimness, as if the walls might be comforted by the reminder. Only another evening. The attic had once been a lumber room. Old trunks were stacked along one wall, some with labels half torn away from travels long forgotten. A cracked dressing screen leaned like a tired sentinel in one corner. Dust motes drifted in the pale light, turning the air into something almost solid when the sun managed to break through the clouds. Her father had never meant for her to live here. The thought came, unbidden, as it always did at such times, and she closed her eyes briefly against it. Sir Thomas Whitmore had built the house with pride, filling it with solid furniture, good books and laughter. He had raised Eleanor in the belief that she, like the oak panels and generous hearths, belonged firmly at its heart. And for a while she had, but her father had died 3 winters ago, the final illness, brief and bewildering. In the months that followed, the rooms Eleanor once moved through freely had grown quieter, cooler. Her stepmother, Lady Agnes, had not been unkind, not precisely. She had simply rearranged everything so that Eleanor did not quite fit. "You know how delicate you are," Lady Agnes had once said gently, fingers tightening on Eleanor's arm for the briefest moment before releasing it. "The physicians were so clear about the need for rest. It would not do for you to be fatigued by small talk and noise. I will tell everyone you are away at the seaside for your health. It is better this way, my dear. The world can be demanding. Better this way." The phrase had echoed like a closing door. Now, when there were callers, Eleanor remained upstairs. When there were musicales or dinners, she was indisposed. Her portrait had been removed from the drawing-room wall. Dresses that no longer suited her new circumstances had been given away. Little by little, with a series of rational explanations, she had been relocated to the upper floor, then to the attic chamber, only until the other rooms are settled. They had never quite settled. Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. She rose and went to the small table pushed beneath the window. Sheets of paper lay there, some filled closely with neat lines of script, others still blank. The ink bottle, carefully stoppered, caught a glint of the grey daylight. She had begun writing letters the previous winter, when the silence seemed too wide to cross any other way. They were not letters to anyone in particular. Sometimes she wrote to her father, knowing full well he would never read them. Sometimes she wrote to a future version of herself, one who lived in a little cottage by the sea and walked with the wind in her hair. More often, she wrote to an unnamed you, a stranger with kind eyes, someone who might understand what it was to feel present and yet invisible, alive and yet tucked away like an old gown in a forgotten trunk. No one would ever see them. That was, perhaps, why they felt so important. Tonight, with the rain for company and the muffled vibrations of distant music in the floorboards, Eleanor dipped her pen and pulled a fresh sheet toward her. "To whoever finds these words," she wrote, though she smiled at her own fancifulness. No one would find them. When each letter was complete, she folded it and slipped it into a box beneath her bed, a small wooden chest that smelled faintly of cedar and secrets. She paused, listening. Was that the notes of a pianoforte below, or only the wind? She continued. "I was once invited to sit in candlelight and laugh with others. I was once expected in drawing rooms and at dinner tables. Now I am expected nowhere. They say it is for my good, that the world is too sharp for someone as quiet as I am. And perhaps it is true. Yet there are moments when I stand at the top of the stairs and hear my name spoken as if I had become a delicate problem that must be put aside." Her hand trembled slightly over the word, and she steadied it. "If ever you have felt placed on a shelf, tucked from sight, not because you are broken, but because you do not match the room as others think it should look, then perhaps you will understand. She wrote until the ink began to blur beneath her dampening eyes. When the letter was finished, she folded it with care, pressing the creases flat. The familiar movement soothed her. Automatically, her hand reached toward the box beneath the bed and met only air. She frowned, bending to look. The box was there, but when she lifted the lid, it was nearly full. Her frail laugh escaped her. It seemed she had been more talkative than she realized. "There is no more room for you," she murmured to the new letter, smoothing its folded edge. "Where are you to go then?" Her gaze drifted around the attic. It landed on a large, leather-bound trunk, standing slightly apart from the others, as if it had recently been moved. She remembered now. The housekeeper had mentioned that some old things were to be sent away in the morning, given to a charity in the poorer quarter. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before crossing to the trunk. The lid groaned softly as she lifted it. Inside lay neatly folded linens, a forgotten set of curtains, a shawl that might once have been fashionable. The scent of lavender sachets clung faintly to the fabric. "Very well," she whispered. She slipped her letter between two folded sheets, tucking it so that it lay straight and hidden, part of one more bundle of things considered no longer needed. The lid closed with a gentle thud. The rain went on, tapping at the window, indifferent. In the morning, footmen would carry the trunk down the narrow back stairs and load it into a waiting cart. Wheels would turn, hooves would splash through the muddy streets, and the house at Grosvenor Square would grow a little emptier, a little more precise, and somewhere, not yet knowing, a man who had forgotten how to hope, would one day open that same trunk and find, among the worn linens and faint scent of lavender, a letter that did not belong to him at all. In the morning, the rain had passed, leaving the sky washed pale and uncertain. A weak shaft of light slipped through the attic window and came to rest across Eleanor's bed, gilding the threadbare coverlet as if it belonged to some finer room. Downstairs, the house was already in motion. Eleanor woke to the muted thumps and calls that meant footmen were moving something heavy along the corridor below. For a moment she lay still, listening without quite knowing why her heart had begun to beat a little faster. Then she remembered the trunk. She rose, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders more from habit than from chill, and crossed to the door. It was not locked. Lady Agnes had never gone so far as to imprison her. It was enough, Eleanor knew, that she had nowhere to go. She opened it a fraction. From this height, voices drifted up, faint and blurred, as if carried through water. She could just make out Mrs. Potter, the housekeeper, giving instructions in brisk tones. "Careful with that one, James. Sir Thomas had it from the continent, or so I was told. Mind the leather. It may yet fetch a decent sum for the charity." A man's answer, respectful, followed by the scrape of wood on polished boards. Eleanor pressed her palm to the banister, picturing the trunk being guided along the passage, down the narrow back staircase, out of her reach. "I thought it was to be given, not sold," came another voice, young Sarah's, the second housemaid. "A sale for the benefit, child," Mrs. Potter replied, her tone softening. "They will send the funds where they are most needed. Think of the poor families, who will have coal for the winter because of it." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Coal for the winter. A trunk in exchange for warmth. It was a reasonable trade. Her letter, tucked within it like a pressed wildflower, would become part of that useful transaction, unseen, unread, then burned or crumpled or left to yellow in some forgotten drawer. That was what she told herself firmly as she went back into the attic. It was foolishness to imagine that words scribbled by a woman who barely existed in her own house could matter anywhere else. Yet for the remainder of the morning, she found herself wandering from one task to another without truly settling. She straightened the stack of books beside her bed, then disturbed them again. She sorted the few dresses hanging from a peg, one for Sundays, one for weekdays, one that had once been suitable for visits, and now was hopelessly out of fashion. Her fingers brushed the fading trim and fell away. Near midday, light footsteps sounded on the attic stairs. Eleanor's spine stiffened, as it always did at any unexpected sound. But when the door opened, it was only Mary, the scullery maid, her hands red from the kitchens, balancing a tray. "Cook says as how you've not eaten," Mary said, setting the tray down with a care that made the crockery rattle only a little. "And Mrs. Potter says as how there's no sense in starving a body while they're trying to mend her." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Mrs. Potter is very kind." "Thank you, Mary." The girl hesitated, then blurted, "There's to be another supper this evening. Her ladyship's orders. A very fine gentleman's coming, that's what I heard, some lord or other very grand. They was polishing the silver till near midnight. Of course there was to be another supper. There usually was." "Then I hope the evening goes well," Eleanor replied, folding her hands around the warm teacup. "For everyone's sake." Mary shifted her weight. "It's a pity, miss. You always looked so very—" She stopped herself, colouring. "Pardon, I've no call to say such things." "So very what?" Eleanor asked gently. "So very much like you belong down there," Mary whispered, her eyes darting toward the door, as if the words themselves were disloyal. "More than some. As sits there now, begging your pardon for saying it." Eleanor's throat tightened. "We all belong where we are needed," she said, though she did not entirely believe it. After Mary left, the attic felt quieter than before. Eleanor ate half a slice of bread, drank her tea and tried not to think about shining silver, ladies in silk, and the careful arrangement of chairs around a gleaming table. Across the city, carriages moved through streets, still damp from the rain. On a modest square not far from Bloomsbury, a building with a plain facade and clean steps was preparing for a different sort of gathering. Within, in a room smelling of ink and beeswax and wool uniforms drying by the fire, a clerk adjusted his spectacles and checked a list twice. "Another trunk has arrived, Your Grace," he said, addressing the tall figure standing by the window, "from the Whitmore household in Grosvenor Square. The items have been logged for the sale." Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Ravensmere, turned from the grey view of the street. The title sat on his shoulders like a coat he had worn so long he no longer remembered putting it on, only the weight of it. "Whitmore," he repeated, accepting the sheet of paper the clerk offered. Inked in tidy script was a list: linens, curtains, shawl, one leather-bound trunk, condition fair. "Yes, Your Grace, sir. Thomas Whitmore's widow, I believe. The lawyer's note said the household is being adjusted." Adjusted. Alexander knew the word and all its meanings. He studied the list for a moment longer than necessary. Sir Thomas had been an acquaintance once, more than that almost, a man whose straightforward laughter he had liked, whose stories about his clever young daughter had filled many a dull club evening. His clever daughter. What was her name? Eleanor? Yes. "I will look over the trunk myself," Alexander said, surprising even his own ears with the decision. "There is no need to place it in the general room just yet." "As you wish, Your Grace." A quarter of an hour later, in a smaller chamber lined with shelves for sorting donations, Alexander stood alone before the leather-bound trunk. The leather was scuffed, the brass fittings dulled, but it was still a solid, dignified piece. He rested his hand on the lid. For no good reason he could name, a faint unease tingled in his chest, as if some curtain within his own life were about to be drawn back a fraction. With a steady breath, the Duke of Ravensmere lifted the lid of the Whitmore trunk. The scent of lavender rose up from the trunk as Alexander lifted the lid, delicate and ghostly. For a moment he simply stood there, fingers resting on the edge, as if he were opening not a piece of furniture but a room in someone else's life. Inside, everything was folded with a care that felt almost tender. Sheets, still white though worn at the edges, a shawl with a pattern just faded enough to suggest it had once been well loved, curtains, their trim a little out of date but neatly coiled to save space. Sir Thomas had always been a man of order. It showed even here, in the remnants of his household. Alexander reached in and lifted one of the folded linens. Something thin and stiff slid against his hand and fluttered back into the shadows of the trunk. He frowned, setting the sheet aside, and saw a small rectangle of cream paper resting among the fabrics. Not a list, not a bill. It had no official look to it at all. He picked it up. The paper was common, but the hand that had filled it was elegant, precise. Ink had soaked slightly into the fibers, softening the edges. Of each line, Alexander felt a strange reluctance to intrude on whatever it contained, but the heading caught him before he could set it aside. "To whoever finds these words," he read on. With each sentence, the small sorting room around him seemed to recede. The letter spoke of candlelight now withheld, of rooms once shared and now forbidden, of a life reshaped until its owner fit nowhere but in the quietest corners. There was no complaint in the words, not exactly, only a clear-eyed sorrow that reached out between the lines and settled in his chest. "They say it is for my good, that the world is too sharp for someone as quiet as I am." Alexander's jaw tightened. The world was sharp. He knew that well enough, but he had never believed quiet souls should be hidden because of it. He read on, slower now. "If ever you have felt placed on a shelf, tucked from sight, not because you are broken, but because you do not match the room as others think it should look, then perhaps you will understand." The sentence struck him with unexpected force. For just a moment, he saw his own reflection, not as the world described him, remote, self-contained, dutiful, but as he sometimes felt, set aside, not because he lacked use, but because grief and obligation had carved him into a shape that did not fit most occasions. He had not always been so. Before the accident that had taken his younger brother, before the illness that had carried off his parents in such quick succession, he had ridden recklessly, laughed without thinking how it might appear, spoken with an ease that surprised even himself. He had intended to marry once, Lady Caroline with the gentle eyes, but loss had wrapped itself around him like a second skin, and the engagement had quietly dissolved. Duty had remained, laughter had not. He reached the end of the letter and discovered no name beyond a single initial, hastily added near the fold. E. He turned the paper over. No address, no date beyond the year scrawled near the top. This current year. No indication of how it had come to be hidden among linens bound for a charity sale, but the trunk was from the Whitmore house. Sir Thomas Whitmore's daughter had been called Eleanor. Alexander read the letter again, slower, searching for any mention of attic or stepmother that might be explicit, but the writer had been careful with particulars. Only the sense of being placed out of sight, of being discussed from a distance, emerged again and again like a quiet refrain. He folded the letter along its original creases, but he did not place it back among the linens. Instead, he slid it into the inner pocket of his coat. It did not feel entirely honest to keep it, but to return it unseen to the trunk felt somehow worse. If Eleanor Whitmore was indeed its author, then something was amiss in Grosvenor Square. "Your Grace," the clerk's voice came from the doorway. "Shall I have the items taken to the main room now?" "Yes," Alexander said slowly, closing the trunk. "Send them along. I shall arrange that this particular piece is credited appropriately to the sale." When the man had gone, Alexander stayed where he was. He drew the letter out again and ran a thumb along the folded edge, thinking of Sir Thomas's booming laugh and the pride with which he had once spoken of his daughter. Bright as a spring morning, that girl. Too clever by half. She will either rule some fortunate household one day or scandalize us all by writing poetry. Alexander slipped the letter away and made his decision. He would call on Lady Agnes Whitmore. It would be outwardly a courtesy visit, his thanks for her contribution to the charitable sale, his condolences renewed for her loss. No one could fault a duke for such attentiveness, but he would watch, he would listen, and he would discover, if he could, what had become of Eleanor Whitmore. In Grosvenor Square that same afternoon, a footman entered the morning room with a silver tray. Lady Agnes looked up from the list she was consulting, the tip of her pencil hovering over a line about flower arrangements. "Yes, Peters? A note from His Grace, the Duke of Ravensmere, my lady, in response to your invitation." Lady Agnes's eyes sharpened. "Well, do not hover like an ornament. Bring it here." She broke the seal delicately, scanning the few lines. A smile, small but satisfied, touched her mouth. "He accepts," she murmured. "Excellent. We shall require more candles in the dining room, and have Miss Charlotte's blue silk pressed. She must look her very best this evening." Peters inclined his head. "And Miss Eleanor, my lady?" Lady Agnes's hand stilled for a fraction, then resumed its poised movement across the page. "Miss Eleanor's health remains too uncertain for such exertion," she said. "The physician was most clear. She will, of course, dine upstairs as usual. See that her tray is not forgotten." At the top of the main staircase, just out of sight, Eleanor stood with one hand resting on the banister. She had caught only fragments of the exchange. The words, "Duke of Ravensmere," the small, pleased note in her stepmother's voice, the mention of candles and blue silk. The name stirred something at the edge of her memory. Her father had spoken of Ravensmere once or twice, she was almost sure. A man he admired, if she recalled correctly. "What nonsense," she whispered to herself, retreating up the final flight to the attic. "What does it matter to you who sits at supper, when you are not even a ghost in the room?" Yet as evening fell and the lamps were lit one by one across Grosvenor Square, two carriages drew up before the Whitmore house, one carrying a duke with a folded letter close to his heart, and above, at a narrow attic window, a woman watched the glow of arriving lights without knowing that her words had already begun to change the course of her life. The Whitmore house sparkled that evening with a determination that bordered on desperation. Candles blazed in every sconce, their light multiplying in the polished glass of mirrors and the gleam of freshly waxed floors. Footmen moved swiftly, adjusting place settings, checking decanters, smoothing a wrinkle here, straightening a chair there, as if the slightest imperfection might offend the eyes of a duke. In the attic, the light was softer, a wash of late sunset fading into grey. Eleanor sat by her small window with her hands wrapped around an empty teacup, listening to the faint echoes that rose through the bones of the house. She could tell when the carriages arrived, the subtle shift of weight in the timbers, the distant murmur of masculine voices, the flutter of quickened movement below. There was a different quality to bustle when it centered upon a single guest of great importance. "They will have the good silver out," she murmured to the glass, tracing a finger along a line of condensation. "And cook will have made the lemon tarts. Charlotte always loved those. Charlotte, Lady Agnes's daughter from her first marriage. Blue-eyed, golden-haired Charlotte, who laughed easily and never seemed to notice when people forgave her every small fault. It was not Charlotte's willingness to be admired that pained Eleanor, but how readily the world obliged. She drew back from the window and crossed to her table. The stack of filled pages in her cedar box had grown so high that the lid would scarcely close. For a moment, she simply stood there, caught between the urge to write and the ache of feeling that she had already said everything there was to say. Instead, she sat and folded her hands as if she were a guest in some other life, waiting to be called. Down in the entrance hall, Alexander handed his hat and gloves to a footman, his expression composed. He was not a man easily dazzled by candles or arrangements of hothouse flowers. He had seen too many grand houses where the brilliance of the rooms barely concealed the cracks in the lives lived within them. Still, he could not deny that Lady Agnes Whitmore knew how to present a scene. "Your Grace." Lady Agnes descended the last few stairs with measured grace, her gown a tasteful dove grey that spoke of lingering widowhood, offset by a modest string of pearls. "What an honour to have you in our home. My late husband held you in such high esteem." "Lady Agnes," Alexander bowed over her hand, "I am grateful for your hospitality and for your generous contribution to the charitable sale." A faint line appeared between her brows. There and gone. One does what one can. Sir Thomas always believed in the duty of those with means to assist those without. "As do I," Alexander replied. "It is one of the few principles upon which my father and I never argued." She gave a little laugh at that, the sound carefully pleasant. "You must allow me to introduce my daughter. Charlotte, my love." Charlotte stepped forward from the drawing-room threshold in a sweep of blue silk. The gown was a perfect choice, becoming without being bold, youthful without appearing childish. Her fair hair shone in the candlelight, her smile bright and eager. "Your Grace," she said, dropping an accomplished curtsy, "we are so pleased that you could join us this evening." "The pleasure is mine, Miss Charlotte," Alexander replied, inclining his head. For a few moments conversation flowed easily. Thanks, condolences, a mention of the weather's improving temperament, a light jest about London's habit of raining hardest when one's best hat was in use, but beneath it all, like a submerged current, Alexander's thoughts circled back to the letter in his pocket and the absence it suggested. He waited until there was a small, natural pause, then said lightly, "I recall that Sir Thomas spoke often of his daughter, Miss Eleanor, I believe. He was very proud of her. Is she with family in the country?" Lady Agnes's fingers tightened, almost imperceptibly, upon the fan she carried. "Eleanor is unfortunately not well enough for society at present," she said smoothly. "The physicians prescribed quiet and rest. She resides upstairs, under my careful supervision." "Indeed?" Alexander kept his tone mild. "I am sorry to hear it. Nothing serious, I trust?" "A weakness of the nerves," Lady Agnes said. "So many young ladies are afflicted these days. She is quite comfortable here, I assure you. My first concern is always her welfare." Charlotte glanced between them, her pretty brow creasing in a show of sisterly concern. "Poor Eleanor grows so fatigued by company," she added. "She prefers her books and her contemplations." "I see," Alexander said. He did not, in fact, see, but he filed away every word. Dinner was announced. They proceeded to the dining room, where the table glittered beneath its weight of glass and silver. Alexander took his place at Lady Agnes's right hand, Charlotte opposite him, and a handful of other guests filling the remaining seats, each one carefully chosen for the impression they might give. Conversation skimmed over safe surfaces, opera, politics at a suitably distant remove, the latest fashions from Paris. Charlotte laughed at all the right moments. Lady Agnes steered topics away from anything that might lead back to the daughter who was not present. Alexander replied when spoken to, even offered a remark or two that drew polite amusement, but his attention never quite left the edges of the room. The doors, the stairway glimpsed beyond, the ceiling above which, somewhere, a woman with a pen and a quiet ache might be listening. When the final course was cleared and the ladies withdrew, he rose with the other gentlemen, but instead of following them at once to the drawing-room, he drifted toward the tall windows at the back of the hall. From this angle, through the glass, he could just make out the uppermost part of the house reflected faintly in the neighboring windows. There, near the roofline, a small square of darkness broke the uniform facade. As he watched, the darkest corner of that little square shifted, just enough to suggest the outline of a figure drawing back from the pane. Alexander's heart gave one measured, deliberate beat. Somewhere above, in a room no one below seemed willing to mention, someone was awake and watching. Eleanor did not see the Duke arrive, but she felt the evening gather itself around his presence all the same. The house had a different sort of tension when someone truly important crossed its threshold, and whatever Lady Agnes might say about serenity and composure, that tension climbed the walls and slipped under doors like a silent draft. Even in the attic, Eleanor sensed it. The slightly quicker footsteps, the sharper ring of the bell, the brief, hushed argument in the corridor outside her room over whether the better tray ought to be sent up to her or reserved below. It was, of course, reserved below. Mary brought her a more modest supper a little later than usual, cheeks flushed, cap slightly askew from the rush of extra duties. "I'm sorry, miss," she gasped, setting the tray down. "Cook near threw the spoon at me for asking after your pudding. His Grace gets the best of it tonight," she said, "and that's the end of it." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I assure you, Mary, I shall not waste away for want of pudding. It smells very good all the same." Mary hesitated, then sank onto the little stool by the door without waiting to be invited, her eyes bright with gossip. "He's not at all what I thought a duke would look like," she said in a rush. "Begging your pardon, miss, I always imagined them with powdered hair or some such, but he's very tall. Quiet, if you take my meaning, not the kind what booms." "A tall, quiet duke," Eleanor said, trying to make it sound as uninteresting as possible. "How alarming." "Oh, but he is, a little," Mary admitted. "Not in a bad way. Just, you can tell he sees things. When Mrs. Potter introduced the gentleman to the footman, his eyes went everywhere like he was taking the house's measure, not in a cruel sort of way, just thoughtful like." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her napkin. "And did he seem pleased with what he saw?" Mary pulled a face. "Her ladyship's flowers are very fine, and Miss Charlotte's gown could be in the papers for fashion, or so she said herself. But I don't know that he came for flowers or gowns." "What did he come for then?" Eleanor asked lightly, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Mary looked at her for a long moment as if weighing something. "He came because of the charity sale, that's what they say. He's the one what's overseeing it, you see. That trunk from here, the one Sir Thomas had from abroad, it went straight to his rooms at the Hall, they say." Eleanor's breath caught, though she made no outward movement. "The trunk?" "Yes, miss. The one from the lumber room. Mrs. Potter said it would fetch a good amount, and the Duke wanted to see to it himself." Mary shrugged. "Not that it matters to us, I suppose. Old things going out, new things coming in." Eleanor swallowed once, carefully. Her heart was making more fuss over a piece of furniture than it ever had over a sleeve of fashion. "Of course," she said, "it does not matter at all." After Mary left, the attic seemed to close in around her. She tried to eat the small portion of stew that had been brought up, but each mouthful felt like a stone. Somewhere in the city, a man who did not know her name had opened a trunk and could, if he chose, lay his hands upon a letter that suddenly felt far too honest. The thought should have embarrassed her. It did, but beneath the embarrassment was something else, a tiny, trembling thread of possibility. Someone might see her words. Someone might feel less alone because of them, or at the very least, someone might know that there was a woman in this house whose existence did not begin and end with the word delicate. Below, Alexander excused himself from the gentleman's after-dinner conversation under the pretext of inquiring after a particular painting Sir Thomas had once shown him. He had a landscape in his study, Alexander said when Lady Agnes rejoined them in the drawing-room, a view of the Northumberland coast. I have seldom forgotten it. If it is not too great an imposition, I would very much like to see it again. Lady Agnes's smile did not reach her eyes. "Of course, Your Grace. The study is much as he left it. Peters will show you the way. I remember the general direction," Alexander said mildly. "If you will permit me, I should like to wander a little. Old friendships deserve more than a hurried glance at familiar walls." It was difficult for Lady Agnes to refuse such a harmless request without revealing that there was anything in her house she preferred not to be seen. "By all means," she said, the fan in her hand fluttering. "Our home is honored by your notice." Alexander stepped out into the corridor, his expression politely neutral. Instead of heading straight to the study, he walked slowly along the passage, listening. He passed a closed door from which music drifted faintly, Charlotte at the pianoforte, offering her practiced accomplishments for the remaining guests. Another door stood slightly ajar, revealing shelves of books and the glint of a decanter, the late Sir Thomas's study waiting. Alexander paused, then moved on. At the turning of the back staircase, he stopped completely. The narrow flight of steps leading upward was less well lit, the runner more worn. A faint smudge darkened the banister, where countless hands with less concern for gloves had rested. From above came no sound at all. That in itself was telling. A lived-in space, however quiet, usually had some murmur to it. Silence, this complete, felt curated. He placed one hand on the rail. "Beg pardon, Your Grace." He turned. Mary stood at the bottom of the stairs, eyes wide, clutching a folded cloth to her apron. She dropped into a hasty curtsy. "Her ladyship asks as you might prefer the study," she said quickly. "This way, if you please." Alexander regarded her for a moment. She was young, but not foolish. There was a wary intelligence in her gaze. "Thank you," he said. "And tell me, do you serve all the upper floors or only the more important ones?" Her throat worked. "I go where I'm told, sir." "I see." He gave a small nod. "Then perhaps, another day, I shall ask you where to find the rest of the house." He allowed her to lead him away, back toward the safe, sanctioned part of the Whitmore home. But as he stepped into the familiar gloom of Sir Thomas's study and accepted the expected wave of memory, he was already considering his next move. He could not storm an attic or demand to see a lady rumored to be unwell, but there were other ways to reach those placed out of sight. He slipped a hand into his pocket and felt the folded paper there, the inked lines that had made his own well-ordered existence feel, for the first time in years, as if it might yet change. If a letter had traveled from her world to his, without either of them intending it, perhaps another could travel back by design. Alexander did not sleep easily that night. Back in his own townhouse, the familiar walls of his study felt less like a refuge than usual, and more like a chamber of echoes. The city had quieted. Only the occasional rattle of a carriage drifted up from the street. A single candle burned low on his desk, spreading a small circle of warm light over scattered papers, an untouched glass of brandy, and the folded letter he had carried all evening. He opened it once more. The words were the same, yet they met him differently now that he had set foot in the house from which they had come. He could match the sense of being placed on a shelf, with the invisible space at the top of the back stairs. The one Lady Agnes's pleasant voice had slid past, as though it did not exist. He drew a fresh sheet of paper toward him and dipped his pen. For a long moment, he hesitated. The world in which he moved had rules, and he had lived by them so long that disregarding any of them felt like stepping out over unseen ground. A gentleman did not, as a matter of course, initiate private correspondence with an unmarried lady, particularly one kept from view. Yet what sort of gentleman read the private outpouring of a heart, clearly in distress, and did nothing at all? The balance tipped. He began to write. "To the writer of the letter, I discovered in a trunk bound for the charitable sale. You did not intend your words for me, and I beg your pardon for having read what was not meant to be read at all. Yet they have reached me, and I cannot return them to silence without at least assuring you that they were not wasted upon indifferent eyes." He paused, then continued, choosing each phrase with care. "You wrote of being tucked away, not for your own sake, but to better suit the appearance of a room. I know something of being arranged to suit appearances. I have worn a title like a shield and a prison both. If I presume too much in saying so, you must forgive the clumsiness of a man unused to such frankness. If you are indeed of Sir Thomas Whitmore's household, then your father was once my friend. He spoke of you with pride. It troubles me to think of his daughter believing herself forgotten." He stopped, aware that his jaw had tightened again. Slowly he relaxed it. "I do not ask you to confide in a stranger. I ask only that you know this. Someone who has never seen your face has nonetheless been altered by the honesty of your pen. Should you wish to send an answer, you may entrust it to the maid called Mary, who I believe carries supper to the upper rooms. If she will deliver it to the office of the Charitable Hall on Bedford Square, addressed only to A.H., it will find its way to me. Whatever you choose, I am, with sincere respect, a friend to your words." He read the letter through twice, then folded it neatly and sealed it with wax. No crest, no sign that might expose him more than necessary, merely his initials pressed into the soft red. The next day he returned to Grosvenor Square under the pretext of bringing further details about the sale, and to deliver personally a note of thanks for Lady Agnes's continued generosity. Lady Agnes received him in the morning room, composed and gracious. They spoke of practicalities for a few minutes, dates and totals, the good that might be done with all that had been given. All the while Alexander listened for footsteps beyond the doorway. When a tray was brought in with tea, Mary followed the older footman, hands folded, eyes lowered. As she turned to withdraw, Alexander stepped slightly into her path, as if by accident. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "Might I trouble you for a moment? It concerns the late Sir Thomas." Mary's eyes flew to his face, then to Lady Agnes, who was occupied with the tea things. Her voice emerged as the faintest whisper. "Yes, sir?" He held out the sealed letter, careful to shield the gesture from the room. "There is someone in this house who should have had more visitors than she has," he said, keeping his tone calm. "I was a friend of Sir Thomas. I would count it a kindness if you could see that this reaches Miss Eleanor. No one else need be aware." Mary's gaze dropped to the letter, then lifted again, searching his face. Whatever she saw there made her swallow hard. "I will do my best, Your Grace," she breathed. "No promises, but I'll try." "That is all one can ask," he replied, and turned back to Lady Agnes, as if nothing of significance had passed between them. An hour later, Mary's heart hammered as she climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, the letter tucked safely into her apron pocket. She had waited until the house was distracted with deliveries and the clatter of coal in the yard before slipping away. In the attic doorway she paused. Eleanor sat at her little table, gaze unfocused, as if listening to something only she could hear. "Miss," Mary said softly. Eleanor looked up. "Has something happened below? You look as if Cook has chased you with a ladle." Mary shut the door behind her. "There's a letter for you," she said, unable to keep the quiver from her voice. "From a gentleman." Eleanor's laugh came out thin. "Do not tease, Mary." "I'm not teasing." Mary drew the sealed envelope from her apron and held it out. "He said he was a friend of Sir Thomas, tall, quiet gentleman, the Duke." The room tilted just slightly. Eleanor stared at the letter as if it might vanish if she looked too directly at it. "From the Duke of Ravensmere." "I don't know his title, miss. Only that he asked it go to you and no one else." Very slowly, Eleanor reached out and took the letter. The seal was plain, the paper thicker than anything she had touched in months. Her fingers trembled as she broke the wax. The first line leapt up at her. "To the writer of the letter I discovered in a trunk." Colour rose in her cheeks. He had read it. A stranger, a duke, had read what she had poured into the safety of hidden linen. Shame prickled at the back of her neck. Then her eyes moved further down and something else replaced it. He wrote not with pity but with understanding, with a curious, careful respect that made her throat ache. By the time she reached the words, "A friend to your words," tears blurred the ink. Mary shifted from foot to foot. "Miss," Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest for a moment, drawing a single shaky breath. "I must have paper," she said quietly, "and ink. At once, if you can. It seems my words have wandered into the world, Mary. I cannot leave them unaccompanied." Mary's feet barely seemed to touch the floor as she hurried down to the kitchen and back again, returning to the attic, breathless but triumphant, her arms full. "There now," she said, spreading her treasures on Eleanor's small table. "Paper from the steward's room. He won't miss a few sheets. And ink that actually flows. Look, miss, a new nib, too. Mr. Hudson never uses it. Says he likes the old one better." Eleanor touched the clean paper as if it was something rare and fragile. In truth, it was only ordinary stock, but after months of writing on whatever scraps she could coax from the household, it felt like a luxury. "Mary," she said softly, "if anyone discovers—" "They won't," Mary interrupted, with more confidence than she truly felt. "I'll not be careless. And even if they did, what of it? There's no law against Miss Eleanor having words of her own." Eleanor smiled, a small startled thing that hadn't visited her face in some time. "No," she murmured. "I suppose there is not." She sat, smoothing her skirt beneath her, and dipped the new nib into the ink. For a moment her hand hovered, uncertain. How did one address a duke who had approached her not as a suitor or sponsor, but as a friend to your words? She began simply. "To the gentleman who found what I never meant to send, you say you were altered by my letter. I scarcely know how to answer that. I wrote it thinking no one would ever see it, and perhaps that is why it was so honest. It seems a strange thing that thoughts tucked into a trunk among worn linens should end up in the hands of a stranger." Her pen moved more surely as she went on. "If you knew my father, then we are not entirely strangers." He spoke often of a man whose sense of duty was matched by his dislike of idle flattery. He said that if all titled gentlemen carried themselves as you did, the world would be a kinder place. I did not think those dinner-table stories would ever return to me in this form. She paused, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. "You must not be troubled on my account. Though I wrote of being placed aside, I am in no danger. I am fed, clothed, and given a roof when many are not. I wish only that you should understand. There is a difference between safety and being alive. I am safe. I am less certain of the other." She hesitated, the nib hovering over the paper, then added more quickly, "It comforts me that you, who I am told see much of the world, have at times felt as I do. Perhaps we are both in our different houses, arranged to improve someone else's picture." She finished with a simple line. "If my words have been a friend to you, then you may know that yours have been the same to me, E.W." When she laid the pen down, her hand was shaking. "Mary," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I do not know if this is foolishness or courage." "Sometimes they're the same thing, miss," Mary replied. "Fold it up now, I'll take it. The sooner it leaves this house, the better I'll feel." They folded and sealed the letter together, Eleanor pressing her signet, an old modest ring of her father's, into the softened wax. It left only a simple W, but even that felt like a reclaiming. Mary hid the envelope in the folds of her apron and slipped back down the stairs, every creak sounding to her like a shout of betrayal. In the kitchen, Mrs. Potter scolded a footman for dropping a plate. Cook muttered over a pot. No one spared Mary more than a glance. By mid-afternoon, she had slipped out on an errand to the grocer with Eleanor's letter tucked safely against her heart. At Bedford Square, the clerk at the charitable hall blinked when a flushed maid thrust an envelope at him and said, "This is for A.H., sir. I was told as it would find him here." "It will," came Alexander's voice from the inner doorway. "Leave it with me." Mary bobbed a curtsy without quite meeting his eyes and fled before she lost her nerve. Alexander waited until he was alone in his study to break the seal. His pulse, to his mild astonishment, had quickened. He read Eleanor's letter once, then again, slower. Her wit ran under every line, quiet but sharp. She did not plead, did not dramatize. She drew precise distinctions between safety and living, between being valued and being curated, that struck him with uncomfortable accuracy. He found himself smiling, just a little, at the remark about both of them improving someone. "Elsie's picture. You see more than most who are permitted to go everywhere," he murmured to the page. "From a room no one admits exists." He sat down at once to reply. They fell into a rhythm that neither had anticipated. Over the next weeks, letters traveled up and down between attic and square, carried in Mary's capable hands, folded into the ordinary bustle of deliveries and errands. Alexander told Eleanor, in guarded outline, of his brother, who had loved speed too much and roads too little, of parents who had thought a title would protect their sons from everything, but had been wrong. Eleanor wrote of books she had read and pictures she imagined from them, of the way the rain sounded different depending on who had been invited to supper below. He never asked directly why she was confined to the attic. She never directly accused anyone of unfairness. Yet between the lines, each learned to read what the other did not quite say. In the attic, color returned slowly to Eleanor's face, though she had no mirror in which to notice it. Her step grew a little lighter. She found herself watching the clock, aligning her day to the likely path of letters through the city. Below, Lady Agnes noticed none of this at first. Her attention was fixed on other matters: Charlotte's new gowns, which relatives to court, which invitations to secure. The Duke of Ravensmere, she told herself, was interested in her charitable contributions and her charming daughter, nothing more. It was not until a rainy afternoon a month later, when she stepped into the corridor and unexpectedly met Mary at the foot of the back stairs, cheeks flushed, apron damp, something hastily tucked into her pocket, that a faint, cold suspicion brushed the edge of her composure. "What have you there, Mary?" she asked, voice still pleasant but silk wrapped around steel. "I do hope my household is not harboring secrets." Mary's fingers inside her pocket closed desperately around the newest letter from Eleanor to the Duke. Mary's fingers inside her pocket tightened around the folded paper until the edges bit her skin. "What have you there, Mary?" Lady Agnes repeated, her tone light, almost amused. "Surely nothing alarming. You look as if the sugar has turned to salt." Mary summoned a breath. "It's only a note, my lady," she said, forcing her voice into steadiness. "From my brother. He's in service with a family near Holborn and sends word now and again. Mrs. Potter said, as how I might read it on my way back to the scullery." Lady Agnes regarded her for a moment. Whatever she was searching for, she seemed to find it. Mary's cheeks were pink with nerves, yes, but there was no open defiance in them, no hint of mischief. "A dutiful brother is a blessing," Lady Agnes said at last. "Do give Mrs. Potter my thanks for permitting you a moment. But see that you finish your work before you become lost in correspondence, child. Letters are pleasant things, but clean dishes are essential." "Yes, my lady," Mary breathed. "I'll remember." Lady Agnes moved on, her mind already turning to the floral arrangements awaiting her approval. Mary stood, very still until the rustle of silk had faded down the hall. Only then did she let out the breath she had been holding and climb the back stairs somewhat less briskly than usual. In the attic, Eleanor had risen halfway from her chair at the first sound of footsteps. When the door opened, she took in Mary's pale face and pressed lips and felt her stomach dip. "Has something happened?" she asked. "Not yet," Mary said, closing the door carefully behind her. "Her ladyship saw me on the stairs, that's all. Asked about the letter, but I told her it was from my brother, which, in a way, it might as well have been." He'd be pleased to know I was doing something bold. Eleanor let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "We must be careful," she murmured. "I will not have you in trouble on my account. I'll not have you in the attic alone forever," Mary countered, softer but no less firm. "So we'll both be careful, miss. That way neither of us need end anywhere we don't wish to be." Eleanor smiled at that, the line of worry between her brows easing. "Wise Mary," she said. "Very well. Let us be careful together." The letter Mary had shielded with her life was from Alexander, written in the late hours when his own household slept and the city exhaled. When Eleanor unfolded it, her fingers tracing the now familiar hand, she felt a peculiar mixture of shyness and eagerness. He wrote of the charitable hall, of stacks of blankets and crates of books, of volunteers who came and went. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "I have been thinking a great deal about the difference you drew between safety and being alive. There are many who are not safe in the simplest, most material sense, yet I suspect there are also many who are safe and yet waiting quietly for some part of themselves to be invited into the world. At the hall, we are considering a small library for those who cannot easily seek books elsewhere, women who are kept busy with their homes or who are not encouraged to venture into public rooms. You write as someone who understands such lives. If you were willing, I would value a page or two of your thoughts on what such a place might give them. Your words would be anonymous, of course, but not, I hope, without consequence." Eleanor read that paragraph 3 times. The idea of anything she wrote being considered in a room full of important people made her stomach flutter and her hands grow cold. Yet the thought of quietly offering something to others like herself that stirred something altogether warmer. "A library," she murmured aloud, "for women who cannot go where books are. Imagine, Mary, a room full of voices for those who have been asked to be so very quiet." Mary's eyes shone. "You should do it, miss, you must." And so over the following days, Eleanor wrote not only to Alexander as a friend to his words, but also a separate, carefully considered piece about small lives and large thoughts. She wrote of women who stitched and scrubbed and soothed children, who might never cross a club threshold or sit in the front row of a lecture, yet whose minds traveled further than their feet ever would if given the chance. She did not mention attics, she did not mention herself, but her understanding threaded through every line. Alexander, reading her pages in his study, felt something in his chest loosen. Her insight was clear, her compassion precise. He brought the pages to the next meeting at the hall and, without naming their author, read several passages aloud. "The writer is an anonymous lady of quality," he said, simply when the other trustees asked. "She has observed what we in our comfortable chairs might not." The discussion that followed was more thoughtful than any they had yet had on the subject. By the end of the evening, the idea of the library had shifted from a pleasant notion to an intention with weight behind it. Later, walking home beneath a sky streaked with the last of the sunset, Alexander realized that he had stopped thinking of his correspondent as merely the writer in the attic and begun thinking of her as something far more immediate. "Eleanor," he said under his breath, tasting the name as if it belonged not only to his memory of Sir Thomas's stories, but to the living woman whose words had walked beside his thoughts for weeks. He knew the patterns of his world too well not to see the road ahead. Invitations were increasing, Charlotte Whitmore's name appearing beside his in conversations with just enough deliberation to make their pairing seem almost inevitable. If he did nothing, the world would arrange him neatly once more. He stopped at the corner, looking back toward Grosvenor Square, invisible in the distance. Somewhere in that direction, behind brick and custom and wrong-headed notions of delicacy, was a woman who had changed the way he viewed his own days, without ever once stepping into the rooms where he was expected. "I must see you," he said softly, as if she might hear him through the miles of city. "Not only your ink, you deserve at least that much courage from me." Eleanor did not know at first what had changed. The letters still came with the same regularity. Mary's quiet footstep on the stair, the small rustle of paper, the moments when ink and thought bridged the space between attic and street. Yet there was something different in Alexander's most recent pages, something that made her pulse catch and her gaze linger on certain sentences, longer than was strictly necessary. He wrote more of himself now, not in grand declarations, but in small, unguarded admissions. The sound his brother's laughter used to make in the mornings, the way he occasionally walked past the charitable hall after hours simply to be certain that the lamps were properly extinguished, a childhood memory. Of being hidden beneath a table during a thunderstorm and listening to the grown-ups pretend they felt no fear. And between these small recollections was threaded a new, quiet insistence. "There is only so much one can come to know of another from ink," he wrote one evening. "I find that I have grown somewhat discontent with the limits of paper." Eleanor ran her fingers over that line until the words grew slightly blurred beneath her touch. Later, in the same letter, he added, "You once wrote that you stand sometimes at the top of the stairs and hear your name spoken as if you were a problem to be arranged. I confess that I have begun to stand, from time to time, at the bottom of a different staircase and feel very much the same. It is an odd thing to find oneself longing to climb towards someone whose existence the household above insists upon overlooking." She sat back in her chair, the letter spread carefully in her lap. Longing. It was not a word tossed about lightly in her world. For months, perhaps years, she had trained herself not to look too closely at her own. Mary, who had lingered by the door as she always did when she sensed something important, shifted her weight. "Bad news, miss?" she ventured. Eleanor looked up. "No," she said slowly. "Quite the opposite. That may be the difficulty." Mary's eyes brightened. "Oh, then it's the very best sort of trouble." Eleanor hesitated. "He wishes to see me properly, not as a shadow on the stair, not as a rumor of delicacy, as myself." Mary smiled so wide she had to clap a hand over her mouth. "Of course he does. How could he not, after all this time? You think you're small up here, miss, but your words go farther than you know." "It is not a simple matter," Eleanor said, though the corners of her own mouth wanted to lift. "Lady Agnes would never approve. The world would never approve. A duke seeking out a woman who is considered—" She could not quite bring herself to say hidden, so Mary said it for her, softly, but without flinching. "Then we won't ask their approval," Mary replied. "We'll be honest with each other instead. He's not talking about dragging you into a ballroom, only about looking at you as if you were a person, not a problem. There's no sin in that. No sin, Eleanor thought, only risk. The risk of wanting more," she wrote back with careful composure. "You are right that ink has its limits," she admitted. "I have, on occasion, wondered what you look like when you smile, or whether your voice changes when you are truly amused. But you must see that to be found alone with you, as matters stand, would be ruinous. For me, more than for you. My position in this house is precarious enough." His answer came faster than usual, as if he had not let the ink dry between paragraphs. "I have no desire to compromise you," he wrote, "nor to play at clandestine meetings as if we were characters in an overblown romance." She smiled despite herself at that. "But I cannot in good conscience continue to ask your spirit to step out onto the page for me while your person is required to remain in the dark. Your father trusted me once, with small matters of business. I feel I owe him and you more than a coward's gratitude." He proposed in the next lines something so simple that it made her blink. "There is," he wrote, "a small morning room on the second floor of your house, at the end of the corridor that leads to the back stairs. Sir Thomas once showed it to me. He called it his thinking room, and said no one else remembered it existed. If you were to come there, at an hour, when the house is distracted, we might have the briefest of conversations with the door properly open and the curtains drawn. No more than that. No whispers in the dark. No danger that could not be explained away, as an old friend of your father's paying a courtesy call." Eleanor knew the room. As a girl she had used it as a secret kingdom, lining up her dolls in the window seat, pretending that the patterned wallpaper was a forest. No one had spoken of it in years. "Mary," she said when she had read the page 3 times through, "how difficult would it be, do you think, for a woman to walk from this attic to the morning room without anyone remarking upon it?" Mary's answer came without hesitation. "At 11, when the butcher's boy comes and cook starts shouting, and Mrs. Potter inspects the laundry, and her ladyship is with the dressmaker, not difficult at all. If you had someone to stand at the bend in the hall and cough loudly should anyone come near." Eleanor's heart beat once hard. "And would I have such a someone?" Mary grinned. "I thought you'd never ask." That night, Eleanor lay awake, long after the house had sunk into its customary noises, the faint groans of settling beams, the far-off rattle of carriages. Her mind traced the path from her narrow bed to the forgotten morning room, from ink on paper to voice in air. "You cannot stay in this half-life forever," she whispered into the darkness, not entirely sure if she meant Alexander or herself. In the morning, when Mary brought up bread and tea, Eleanor's answer was ready, folded once and sealed with care. "Tell him," she wrote, "that at 11 tomorrow, if the house does not fall down or the sky does not open, I will walk down 1 flight of stairs and into my father's thinking room. If he chooses to stand, there instead of at the bottom of other people's steps. Then we shall see what we see." She handed the letter to Mary with fingers that trembled only a little. "Careful together," Mary reminded her. "Careful together," Eleanor echoed, though inside her, something that had been quiet for a very long time was standing straight and taking its first unsteady steps toward the light. The morning chose perversely to be beautiful. Sunlight slipped through the attic window in bright, determined shafts, catching dust motes and turning them to tiny, spinning stars. Eleanor stood before the small, cracked mirror Mary had smuggled up for her months ago and regarded her own reflection as if it belonged to someone she had once known and misplaced. Mary had laid out her best gown, a soft green muslin, a few seasons old, but still flattering. The trimming at the sleeves was a little tired, yet the color made her eyes look deeper, and the cut still suggested a waist and shoulders meant for more than hiding. "It will do," Eleanor murmured. "It will more than do," Mary replied firmly, fussing with the ribbon at the back. "He's seen your mind for weeks. He ought to be grateful to see the rest of you catch up." Eleanor laughed, though it emerged shakier than she intended. "I am not certain my courage has caught up," she admitted. "My heart seems intent on stopping altogether, then starting again twice as fast." "That only proves it's working," Mary said. "Now, we've a quarter of an hour yet. Her ladyship is with the dressmaker in the front parlour. Miss Charlotte is being pinned with pins in places I'd rather not think about. Cook is shouting about a late delivery of flour. Mrs. Potter is doing battle with the laundry. If the Lord himself wanted to walk through this house unnoticed, he'd pick now." "That sounds almost sacrilegious," Eleanor murmured, but she smiled. Mary took her hands briefly, squeezed them hard. "Careful together," she said. "Careful together," Eleanor echoed. The walk from the attic to the second floor had never seemed so long. She descended the narrow back stair, the worn runner muffling her steps. At the bend in the corridor, Mary took up her post, a bundle of towels over one arm, an air of busy innocence about her. If anyone came, she would cough twice loud enough to carry. Eleanor drew a breath and walked on. The door to her father's thinking room stood slightly ajar, exactly as Alexander had described he would leave it, open enough to be innocent, closed enough to suggest privacy without secrecy. Her palm was damp against the wood as she pushed it wider. For a moment she saw only the room as it had once been, the window seat, with its faded cushions, the familiar pattern of the wallpaper, the small table where Sir Thomas had once spread maps and ledgers, and, occasionally, toy soldiers when explaining some historical campaign. Then the figure by the window turned. She had tried, in idle, guilty moments, to imagine him. She had pictured a dozen possibilities and dismissed them all as foolish. None of them had prepared her for the man who actually stood before her. He was taller than she had expected, his shoulders broad beneath a well-cut coat that managed to look simple despite the quality of its cloth. His hair was dark, threaded here and there with the first hints of silver at the temples. His face was not handsome in the way fashion plates declared, his nose a touch too strong, his mouth set more often to thought than to charm, but his eyes were the colour of storm clouds just before rain, and in them she saw exactly what his letters had promised: perception, weariness, a stubborn kindness. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. "Eleanor." Her throat tightened around her own name. "Your Grace," she began, then stopped, because the title suddenly felt like the least true thing in the room. "Alexander." His gaze softened at that. "Thank you," he said, "for coming." They regarded one another for a heartbeat, too. The silence between them felt oddly familiar, like the pause between paragraphs in a letter. "You are not at all what I expected," she blurted, then flushed. "Forgive me. That was terribly rude." He smiled, and she realized with a small jolt that she had been wondering about that very expression for weeks. It changed his whole face, releasing something gentler that had been held back. "On the contrary," he said, "I am relieved to know that I had not become too predictable. Even in another person's imagination, I confess I had feared you might expect a figure from an improving novel, stern perhaps, or irritatingly noble. You are not irritating," she said, then caught herself. "Not yet, at least." A brief, warm laugh escaped him. "Then I shall do my utmost to remain merely tolerable." The word pulled a memory from her, a conversation years ago, a jest her father had made about some book or other. For a moment she saw Sir Thomas leaning in this very doorway, watching them with that particular fond pride he had always reserved for her. Her eyes stung. She folded her hands together to steady herself. "I am glad you came as well," she said. "I have spent so long being spoken about instead of spoken to that I had almost forgotten how to begin." "Then we shall begin simply," he replied, "by standing in a room your father loved and acknowledging that his daughter has been far too long removed from it." He moved no closer, as if wary of crowding her. She was absurdly grateful for that. "I read what you wrote for the library," he went on. "They do not know your name, those men on the committee, but they listen to you all the same. They are already drawing plans for shelves and windows. Your thoughts are shaping spaces, Eleanor, even if you are not permitted to step into them yet." Something loosened inside her at his words. "It seems a strange kind of haunting," she said softly, "to be present only in the echo of one's sentences." "If that is haunting," he answered, "it is the kind the world needs more of." She laughed, a small sound that still felt like a rebellion. Outside the half-open door, the house breathed and bustled. Somewhere far away, a bell rang. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, just to feel the air against her lashes, to memorize this impossible moment. The pattern of light on the carpet, the faint scent of dust and old ink, the living presence of someone who had read her and not turned away. A cough sounded in the corridor. Once. Then, after a heartbeat, again, louder. Mary. Eleanor's eyes flew to Alexander's. In them she saw alertness replace the quiet ease they had begun to share. "Someone is coming," she whispered. He inclined his head. "Then we shall be exactly what I told you we would be," he said calmly. "An old friend of your father's and the daughter he never had the chance to present to me." Footsteps approached, sharper than Mary's quick tread, the kind of footsteps that expected rooms to be ready for them. The door, which had been standing politely ajar, moved another inch, then another, under a hand they could not yet see. The door swung inward with a soft, undeniable authority. Lady Agnes stood on the threshold. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Sunlight from the high window caught the pale silk of her gown, the precise arrangement of her hair, the small pearl pins glinting like points of frost. Her gaze took in the scene. Eleanor in her green muslin near the table, Alexander by the window, the door open between them, the almost tangible thread of understanding in the air. Mary's cough died away in the corridor behind her. "Your Grace," Lady Agnes said at last. Her voice was even, but Eleanor heard the minute tremor beneath it. "I was told you had gone out." "I returned," Alexander replied calmly. "I found myself thinking of Sir Thomas, and he often spoke of this room. I thought to pay my respects to his memory and to his daughter." Lady Agnes's eyes flicked to Eleanor, then back. "Eleanor is unwell," she said, out of habit more than conviction. "The physician has perhaps been quoted more often than he has been heard," Alexander said, gentle but firm. "Forgive me, Lady Agnes. I speak as someone who has watched too many people mistaken for fragile because they were quiet in their grief." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. She wanted to shrink back, to apologize for existing at the center of such a conversation. Instead, she forced her shoulders to remain where they were. "I invited Miss Whitmore here," Alexander continued, before Lady Agnes could answer. "My invitation was not clandestine. The door is open. Her reputation is not in danger from courtesy shown in broad daylight in her father's own house." Lady Agnes stepped into the room. The faint scent of lavender and starch followed her, the fragrance of rooms where everything was in its proper place. "You ought to have consulted me," she said. There was no anger in it, only tightness. "You are quite right," Alexander answered. "I should have come to you months ago when I found Eleanor's letter. I hesitated, and that hesitation was an error I am now attempting to mend." Eleanor froze. "My letter?" Lady Agnes's head turned sharply. "What letter?" For a moment Eleanor considered silence. It would be easy to let Alexander speak around her, over her, as others so often did, but that was precisely the life she no longer wished to live. "My letter," she said quietly, "one I hid in a trunk believing it would go to dust with old linen. Your Grace found it at the hall, among the donations. He chose not to ignore it." Lady Agnes stared at her, astonishment loosening something rigid in her gaze. "You have been writing to him?" "To a man who read my words and did not treat them as a curiosity," Eleanor answered, equally soft. "He asked nothing of me but honesty. I have had few such requests in recent years." Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Charlotte appeared behind her mother, cheeks pink from the dressmaker's pins, curiosity bright in her eyes. "Mama, Mrs. Ellison is asking if—" "Oh," she stopped, taking in the tableau. "Eleanor, and Your Grace, it seems we are having rather more of a family gathering than intended," Alexander said, with a small wry half-smile. Lady Agnes drew a breath. When she spoke, some of the stiffness had left her tone, leaving something more human. "Eleanor," she said, "you must understand I kept you above stairs because I thought it best. After your father died, you could scarcely eat, scarcely speak. You flinched at every visitor. People talk cruelly when a young woman does not smile on command. I did not wish them to make you their pastime." "I know you meant to protect me," Eleanor replied, "but protection became absence. I cease to be a person at all except as a cautionary tale whispered over tea. Charlotte stepped closer, eyes shining with something like remorse. I should have said something, she blurted. You always listened when I fretted over gowns and partners, and I let Mama's explanations make sense of your absence because it was easier. I am sorry, Eleanor. The apology, simple and unadorned, startled Eleanor more than any protest would have done. Tears pricked behind her eyes. Alexander looked from one woman to the other. I do not presume to understand the intricacies of your household, he said, but I do know this. Sir Thomas wished his daughter to live, not only to be safe. His words to me were very clear on that point, and I know that Miss Whitmore's mind has already done more good in the world than she realizes. The proposed library at the Hall bears her unseen imprint. Charlotte blinked. The library? Eleanor, truly. Eleanor nodded a little shyly. He asked my thoughts. I gave them. It appears they listened. Lady Agnes's hand tightened briefly on the back of a chair. And what is it you wish now, Your Grace? She asked. You stand in my late husband's house in a room I had foolishly forgotten with my stepdaughter whose care was entrusted to me. What is it that you seek? Alexander met her gaze squarely. I seek the chance to know Eleanor openly, he said, not as a hidden correspondent, but as a woman whose company I value. I would ask your permission to call upon her properly in your drawing room, to invite her in time, to advise not only a library, but other endeavors that might benefit from her understanding. He hesitated, then added with deliberate clarity, and if, after such acquaintance, she were willing, I would ask leave to pay her my addresses, with the respect due Sir Thomas's daughter, and under the full protection of your household's good name. Charlotte let out a faint, delighted sound before clapping a hand over her mouth. Lady Agnes closed her eyes for a moment. I am no monster, Your Grace, she said quietly. Only a woman who has been afraid of losing everything twice. I lost one husband and feared the world would take what security remained. I thought if I could keep all delicate things tucked away, nothing more could break. She opened her eyes again, and in them Eleanor saw genuine regret. In doing so, it seems I broke other things instead, Lady Agnes finished. Eleanor, if I have made you feel invisible, I beg your forgiveness. Eleanor's breath hitched. There were many words she might have spoken, grievances she could have laid out like stones. Instead, she chose the one thing that mattered most. I only ever wanted to stand where people could see me and not look away, she said. If you can allow that, I believe we can begin again. Lady Agnes nodded once. Then we shall, she said. You will come down to dinner this evening. A ghost of a smile softened her mouth. I dare say the lemon tarts have missed you. The tension in the room eased, as if some tight thread had finally been cut. Charlotte rushed forward and took Eleanor's hands, squeezing them with sisterly enthusiasm. Oh, Eleanor, she whispered, you in the drawing room will frighten all the shallow people away. I cannot wait. Alexander's gaze met Eleanor's over their joined hands. In it, she saw something steady, warm, and utterly without pity. Later that year, on a bright afternoon, the new library at the charitable hall opened its doors. Women of every station came, maids smelling of soap, widows in plain black, wives with careful bonnets. They sat in chairs by the windows and held books as if they were delicate, astonishing creatures. Eleanor walked among them, not as a ghost, but as a quiet guide. Mary, now officially employed as an assistant at the hall, shelved volumes nearby, humming under her breath. From across the room, Alexander watched, a book in his own hand, his expression composed but lit with a private joy. The formal courtship that followed their first meeting had been proper in every particular. The engagement quietly celebrated, the wedding when it came more about promises than spectacle. On evenings when the day's work was done, Eleanor still took out her papers and wrote. But her letters now were not pleas dashed into the dark. They were invitations, ideas, stories she shared with a world that had finally discovered she existed. Sometimes she wrote to the girl she had once been, the one pressed into an attic with her heart wrapped too tightly. She told her about thinking rooms and open doors, about friends who knocked instead of whispered, about a duke who had found a letter and answered with his own courage. And if the rain tapped at the windows of her new home, she welcomed it, knowing that she no longer had to watch life from the highest, furthest room. She stood at the center of her own story at last, seen and cherished, her words and her heart no longer hidden away.